Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The State of Innovation in Higher Education, a survey of academic administrators. My name is Alex Seabrook, Events Marketing Specialist at Learning House, and I'm happy to be joined today by Andrew J. Magda, Manager of Market Research at Learning House, and Dr. Jill Buban, Senior Director of Research and Innovation at the Online Learning Consortium. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items. First, we welcome your questions and comments. Please type your questions and comments into the Q&A pane, and be sure to send your message to all panelists, and not only the host or presenter, to ensure they get answered. A moderator will respond to the questions in the Q&A pane throughout the presentation. Our presenters may answer questions throughout the webinar if time allows, and we will also take 15 minutes following today's 45-minute presentation for our presenters to answer your questions. A copy of today's webinar PowerPoint slides, as well as a recording of today's presentation, will be sent to all attendees. And now, I will introduce our panelists. Andrew J. Magda is the Manager of Market Research at the Learning House. He leads in the development of custom and large-scale market research studies and assists partner institutions with their research needs. Prior to Learning House, Andrew was a senior analyst at EduVentures and a project manager at the Center for Survey Research and Analysts at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Jill Buban serves as the Senior Director of Research and Innovation for the Online Learning Consortium. In this role, she oversees the OLC Research Center for Digital Learning and Leadership, works on key strategic leadership initiatives such as the Leadership Network, and oversees the organization's peer-reviewed journal, Online Learning. Jill is a member of the Senior Leadership Group for the Association of Chief Academic Officers Digital Fellows and the Board of Directors at the National University Technology Networks. And now, I turn the presentation over to Andrew and Jill.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jill Buban, and on behalf of Andrew and myself, we give you a warm welcome. We're really excited to be presenting the results of this survey today with you all. It looks like there's just over 150 of you on the webinar, so this is wonderful to be sharing this information so broadly, and I have to say hello to some friends I see in the audience. So hello and welcome. We've been, a little background on this, we have been working on this survey for well over a year now, and launched the survey at OLC Innovate in Nashville last month. So this is, we kind of gave it our dry run there, and now we're ready to hit the stage with all of you today. So as mentioned, please feel free to put some questions in the chat, in the question area, answer area, and Andrew and I will get to those, or we can answer them at the end in the last 15 minutes. So a little bit about the background. As I mentioned, we've been working on this for just over a year together. Learning House and OLC had many conversations about different topics that are really pertinent to the field of digital learning right now. And the word innovation kept coming up in conversations. So we kept seeing, you know, obviously we all see it on Twitter and our news feeds and the media, campuses, and we're thinking, like, what is this just a buzzword? What does it mean to people? And what do people on campuses really think about this term, and what it means on their individual campuses? So we were really looking at where is innovation housed on campuses, if it is housed, how can it be fostered and kind of respected on campuses? So with that in mind, we surveyed just more than 100 academic administrators, and then we did follow-up phone interviews with 11 of those administrators. So to get us started, we knew that it was important to kind of frame the term innovation, especially, as I just mentioned, as we see it so often everywhere and used so differently. So we strove to keep the definition broad, knowing that innovation can be seen in many different areas on campuses, not only with educational technology and digital learning initiatives. So as you can see, we went with the definition of the implementation of new initiatives in order to drive growth, increase revenue, reduce cost, differentiate experience, or adjust the value proposition. So we framed this at the beginning of the survey so that our respondents could have that in mind as they went through the survey, but we also asked them what their thoughts were on the definition and how they more broadly define innovation. And as you can see, we had a wide array of responses, including teaching and learning with pedagogies and new approaches, research, which is, of course, from my perspective, always great to hear in my role, but really looking at new ways to enhance instruction, changing the education delivery to appeal to a new target population, or implementing ideas to bring about better outcomes. So those are all really focusing on that student, the student-centered pedagogical approaches higher ed campuses. And we really saw that throughout the survey, and we'll touch on this a little later, but the majority of administrators responded that their main goal was very student-centric, and the main goal of innovation was to have, better outcomes, retention, persistence, but better outcomes in terms of student success. I'm going to pass this over to Andrew at this point.
Hi. So as Jill was saying, as we asked the question in the survey and the follow-up interviews, we got a myriad of responses into what the on-campus definition for innovation was. But it seemed to focus, coalesce around problem solving, and the important thing we wanted to note at the beginning here is a quote here that we received from Florida Atlantic University with one of our follow-up interviews, and it was that the feeling of being empowered from the top levels of the organization, but also being empowered in a way that if there was failure as we were trying to solve one of these problems through innovation, that there wasn't any negative consequences that they felt would come down upon them. It was allowing individuals to innovate freely, be able to pursue different paths, multiple paths, and knowing that it wasn't necessarily going to lead, if it didn't lead to the best success or the possible, that there wasn't necessarily going to be negative consequences to that. So one of the questions we asked was labeling your institution in regards to its position on innovation. So even though that there wasn't an exact definition given by every institution, and not that all those definitions given were the same, it was interesting to us that nonetheless the majority still felt that they were a fast follower or on the leading edge of innovation. So you see 50% there on those top two green bars. So even though the definitions were not necessarily precise, they still felt that they were exceeding their own definitions that they were given. So that we thought that was interesting, that even though there wasn't this exact definition, that so many felt they were doing a really good job at innovation on their campus. But we also found through one of our follow-up interviews with someone who didn't necessarily want to be identified, but was an interesting take that at their institution, they felt that they didn't necessarily have to be on that bleeding edge of innovation on campus. They felt they took a more sit back and watch approach to innovation. They kept an eye on their peer institutions and other institutions across the country that had like-minded goals of them, allowed to see what paths they were taking on campus with innovation, and then following up on those areas of success and learning from the mistakes at other institutions. So that was just a different route that individuals could take. So if we go back and look at these positions on innovation, one doesn't necessarily have to be that fast follower or on the bleeding edge. they could still say around the middle here, average 32%, but still have strong goals towards innovation, but taking a more step back approach, not necessarily being the first to market or the leader in the pack, but seeing and learning from the mistakes of others as they pursue innovation on their campuses. So here we were looking at to see on campus were individuals taking a planned or unplanned approach to innovation, meaning were there exact goals and plans in place for innovation, and also at the same time, is it decentralized, meaning that each different unit and department was in charge of their own innovation, or is it more centralized, say a center for innovation on the campus that was leading the charge for that institution? And we see that most were decentralized, but still took somewhat of a planned approach there. So if we look at planned, kind of the dark navy blue on the bottom there, you see 43%. So that means that they do have formal plans on their campus goals and perhaps benchmarks that they're trying to follow, but yet still taking a decentralized approach, meaning that each individual unit or department could be empowered to take their own stance and follow through. If we also take the other more orange shaded part of the pie and we bring that in, you could see that there's an additional 26% that also are planning, but maybe have a more formal role or department that is leading up that charge and looking over at what is going on in terms of innovation on the campus. So a good percent there taking a more planned approach, but a little bit of variance there in terms of, is there one person in charge of it, or is there a more decentralized approach on campus there? Jill, did you want to talk about the strategic plans?
Yeah, and I think Andrew knows this was of real interest to me in looking at, is innovation a priority in your strategic or academic plan? So, right, I think a lot of times we're looking at the strategic plan in terms of the entire institution, and then oftentimes the institution, as you all know, also has an academic plan within its Office of Academic Affairs. So looking at yes, it's somewhere in our plans, either strategic or academic. We're looking at 64% of respondents. So I think, and then saying that it's in both plans, so both institution-wide and in the academic side of the house at 27%. So the majority of representatives from institutions that we surveyed are definitely thinking about innovation enough that they're trying to plan for it, right? But, you know, interestingly, and we'll get into this in a little bit, they're also saying that that there's not particularly funding put aside for innovative initiatives, and we'll get into that a bit as well. So people are obviously not only just thinking about it in small work groups or focus groups, groups of faculty or instructional designers or, you know, the registrar's office even, but they're really planning ahead and looking at innovation on their campuses.
Jill, can I just jump in here with just a question or a thought that we see popping up here? Sure. It kind of goes back to one of our previous slides around being ahead of the curve on innovation. It says only 2% felt they were behind. So did you just want to speak just a little bit about when we were sending this out, that perhaps given the topic, those that maybe were a little more advanced in innovation were more likely to take the survey. So you know, some of the terms of those being behind may not be the full percent there.
Yeah, I think that when we started going through the results, as Andrew just mentioned, I think in methodology and in terms of you know, research methods, we know that folks that are taking surveys tend to, if their confidence level is higher, that they might respond. They might be more likely to respond. So I think it's great that we had a few people, well, just a couple, that took a gander and responded anyway and saying that they were way behind on the innovation scale. So as Andrew said, we do feel like the population was probably skewed a little towards those that did feel they were innovative on their campus and therefore responded to the survey. I hope that I'm looking in the question and answer. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. And then just the slide you were just on in terms of the strategic plan.
Sure.
When we were conducting the interviews, do you recall individuals mentioning in the strategic plan how innovation was regarded for? Were there specific goals attached to it, or do we feel it was more innovation for innovation's sake, just playing lip service to it more than actually setting goals and plans in place?
That's a great question. I'm looking through the question and answer there. I don't remember specifically through the interviews, but I think that that's an excellent follow-up question, and it's something, whoever that is out there in the audience, if you want to send a follow-up email to myself and Andrew, I'm going to type my email in the box. I know it was at the beginning, but if you're like me, you never write that stuff down. And I'm happy to kind of check some of those transcripts and see if we have an answer for you, but yeah, I don't recall right off the top of my head. It brings up a thought that I've had, that the innovation for innovation's sake is interesting, and I do think that goes back to a buzzword. So yeah, sure, it could be put in there. But also kind of this overarching label of innovation. I do hear some questions on that funding, the funding question that I posed. And I think because we're labeling it so broadly, we could have innovative practices on campuses that have been funded. So let's say we're implementing digital courseware or some type of adaptive learning, right? I think for a campus implementing that or scaling that would be seen as innovation. Now, there could be budget money for that, but that budget money is labeled as adaptive learning. It's not labeled as innovation. So I think some of the language too and how it's interpreted is always, you know, something we have to think about in surveys. So I hope that helps, and I am trying to type my email in there, so I will, I'd be happy to look that up for whomever posed the question.
Great, thank you.
Great, so getting back here, because I do want to also watch our time so we can get to more questions at the end. You can see in this slide, we looked at those areas of innovation that were ranked in the top 3. So we asked the respondents to rank those areas. So again, this is a lot to digest, just looking at the slide, but you will be getting a copy of the report if you don't have it already. And then the darker green is the percentage that were ranked number 1. So obviously, all the way to the left there, a lot of folks seeing innovation within the non-traditional programs. And, you know, this is also an afterthought of ours. We used, you know, some more traditional language in terms of traditional versus non-traditional. A lot of times online, shockingly, it's still kind of lumped in that non-traditional. So we have, you know, there's some areas here in terms of labels, but within non-traditional, we also see adult learning programs, right, or CBE programs, or if we're doing certificates or non-degree granting. So it seems like folks are a little more willing or accepting of innovation within those programs as opposed to that traditional side. Again, teaching and pedagogy and within academic affairs. So really tilted towards the academic side of the house. That's where we're thinking these innovations are happening. And looking at both ranking the top 3 and ranking number 1, so that obviously teaching and pedagogy is really highly ranked. And then it's, Andrew and I kind of laughed about this a little bit, or after the presentation in Nashville last month, the registrar's office had a 0 for the number 1 and a low 5% even in the top 3. And again, in really kind of reflecting on the survey, and since we've been looking at the results, I think again we can be a danger for how we're associating the word innovation with specific practices on campuses. If we're moving academics forward, again, implementing technology where, registrars implementing like data warehouse or different systems that assist students could really be an innovation for the campus, could save money, save time, save manpower. So I think, again, it's like how we're linking that term and how can we be looking at it more broadly, because we see advancement in fundraising, and we know all of us, I'm sure, that are working on campuses, we know right now, advancement's really important on campuses, and I think it's becoming more and more important to have that connection to funders, to alumni, and how can we look at that differently? How can we engage with that group differently? So I think, again, I hate to stress this too much, but really just looking at how we're using that term and how it means more than just a certain subset. So it's great to see that it's in these student-centered areas, and we oftentimes think of academia and teaching pedagogy as innovative, but there's opportunities all over campus.
Jill, can we just go back one slide there?
Of course we can.
Is there any reason you would see that retention, as you see the top 3%, there's 31%, is so much higher than enrollment, 16%?
That's is that a question from our audience, Andrew?
It is.
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think in terms of innovation, again, we saw student success is really on the minds of these respondents to the survey. And so I think retention, if we can be innovative and retain our students, it equates to student success in their minds. Enrollment it's interesting to me too. We don't often think, or according to this survey, we're not really thinking of ways to be innovative with our enrollment processes. And maybe this is a cue that that's an area we could be looking at. But to specifically answer the question, I just think retention is on the minds. I don't remember what the percentages are anymore, but it costs so much to enroll a student, right, to market to, attract, and enroll a student that we want to retain them once they're in the institution. And I'm sure that that's part of the reflection here in this data. I'll just take this one really quickly too. I see, was there a pattern of people associating innovation with going rogue? And I unfortunately, I don't know that, I don't remember that term or in any of the qualitative responses, so I can't really say. I don't think so. There was nothing like I'm going at this on my own. Again, I think that could be an interesting follow-up question. So here, we were looking at different ways in which innovation, when we were talking to folks that we interviewed, how innovation is kind of incubated on campus and how that works at some of these institutions. And Evangeline Cummings from University of Florida was really looking at how to connect innovators on campus and how to give them the area in which they can innovate. And, we've heard that, I think, in a few other recent reports, whether it was Michael Horn or Jeff Salingo, in one of their recent reports, it was similar, like how do we give space to innovators? How do we, is it within the institution, is there a separate hub for innovation? So I think we're hearing this a lot, and we're understanding that there are people on campus that I think are natural innovators. right? And those are the people that we often think of as like we're going to put them together and they're going to be able to make this kind of, they'll be able to nurture this innovation and let it germinate and hopefully spread. And that kind of can help with the change management process of an innovative idea and putting that forth into practice. So I think that Evangeline's comment, I think we're going to see that more and more on campuses as we continue to be talking about innovation and how it works on campuses. We asked the question what the main goals for innovation are at your institution today. And again, like we're looking at those who ranked in the top 3 and those ranked number 1. So, you know, ensure student success, as I've been saying the past 5 or 10 minutes here, was definitely number 1, and this is the slide that shows that. So 68% ranked that in the top 3, while 47%, nearly half of the respondents ranked it as number 1, and clearly nothing is in that same area that just completely overshadows the other. But you can see that there's ranked in the top 3, there's quite a few that are in the third of respondents there, and creating new degree programs, decreasing costs, developing new teaching methods, and interestingly, creating alternative credentials. So that was kind of a highlight for me to see the creating alternative credentials, because again, I think that's something we're reading a lot about, and how are we creating them? How are we fostering room for pathways to evaluate credentials or accept them within a degree program? So I think that's an area we're all going to be continuing to watch there. But looking at those in the 30%, they're all again tied back to really the academic program, with the exception of decreasing costs. Of course, we can decrease costs in academics as well, but really focused on the student, focused on academics. Okay, and Dr. House from Houston University, again, these are just some really quotes that stood out to us throughout the interviews. So new ways at being as effective as possible, achieving our mission of teaching classes and reaching students. So really exemplifies at a smaller institution, it's still the student-centric. How are we innovative in order to better serve our students? Oh, I see. I'm kind of watching the chat as it's coming through and kind of thinking about what I'm talking with you all about this. And I see a comment from Susan Owen that, yes, competency-based learning is really low. I'm just going back to look. So, yeah, that's an interesting, yeah, she just put this in slide 3. But, yes, it's interesting that that is low. And I don't know, again, you know, I think there's a few institutions, and we've all read about them, know about them, that are doing that really well, and others are still kind of onboarding and figuring it out how it can fit within their institution's plan, or, you know, if it's the right option for their institution. So just not on the mind as much as some of these other initiatives. And, you know, I think for those of us that know competency-based education, you're really looking out at building another system within the institution. So it's quite a bit to bite off there. Okay, so we looked at, and this is another part that, and I am watching the time here, Andrew, don't worry, but another part I really liked looking at and thinking about. To what extent do students drive innovation at your campus? And I know this was a topic of discussion of another group meeting that just met at Arizona State University, and thinking, how do we really get students involved in innovation, and are we thinking about the students? So I was actually shocked to see that more than 50% said that students drove innovation either moderately or significantly, that they played this moderate or significant role in doing that. I think this is another area that I'd love to dive into and see what that role is. Is it merely through student government association or something like that, or Is it surveys? But that role of how students are involved, you know, I think it's really critical to be involving the students and better understanding even what their definition of innovation is and how they're contributing to that on campus. So this, again, we've trying to highlight some of the ways in which our respondents in the qualitative section talked about innovation. And this was Dr. Neapolitan at Towson University in Maryland, and one example was how they helped foster innovation by providing small stipends for faculty to use OERs in the course. So we knew, you know, looking at OER as kind of the innovation, the small stipend for faculty is the driver to implement that innovation. And obviously that OER is most likely going to save students a lot of money and very, again, example of the student-centered innovation on campus. So, and, you know, she says the student brought that idea. So not only is it like this exemplifies that process of an innovation, how the institution drove it, but how the student brought that idea forward and it was implemented at the institution. So one example of that student involvement, while we know there's other ways they could be fostering innovation on campuses. Andrew, did you want to talk about how this, the funnel?
Sure. So towards the end of the report, we didn't actually put an actual conclusions and recommendations section per se. We titled it Lessons Learned, as we knew that as we went through this process that there is no right or wrong path or one exact path an institution could or should take. So we just wanted to bring up together at a higher level some of the lessons that we've learned, and by talking to some of the institutions that seem to be doing a little bit more with innovation, kind of pushing it on campus, those that would maybe classify themselves as that bleeding edge is one of our early questions there. So what were they doing and how did that look, and so we can share that, you know, with you in the report and through this webinar. So we found at those institutions, it seemed that innovation was really important at the top level of the institution. So the president, the provost, the board, there was someone in that leadership role that was pushing for the institution to move forward on some efforts using innovation. And what they did as they were pushing this from the top, not necessarily in a forceful manner, but in a more you know, paying knowledge to it when they were giving different speeches on campus, putting it in a strategic plan, bringing it up during different meetings to set goals for it and to follow up and provide accountability to those goals, but also opening up funding for different efforts on campus, whether it be stipends, as we were just talking about with OER for faculty, or is it to provide different grants, or if it was to annual awards to faculty, or even including students in there that led different efforts on campus to pay recognition to them, highlight them to the campus community, call them out as good campus citizens, and perhaps even having an award tied to, you know, a monetary award tied to those annual awards for those students or faculty. So really providing and trying to foster that culture on campus that innovation is important here, and we are, you know, these are our goals, and this is how we're going to try to obtain those goals. From there, that message from that top level was then disseminated down to the different departments. Again, accountability attached to specific goals that were put into the strategic plan. Those goals obviously were measurable and checked upon throughout the process to make sure that these goals were being met, but at the same time, you know, providing that culture where failure could be an option to that. So learning from some of those mistakes as they work through, maybe adjusting those goals given the information coming, but not just putting it into the plan with no real accountability process attached to it. knowing that, that there were expectations for the goals being set. Also, involving all different groups within the campus, so including the students, as we were just talking about, the administrators. Obviously, we talked about them, providing that culture for innovation, that culture for failure, learning from failure and mistake, opening up funds for different efforts, and also engaging with the faculty and staff for idea generation, for some of these, empowering them, as we'll talk about here, empowering all these different groups to ensure that everyone on campus could be a leader for innovation. There is no necessarily singular person that is in charge with it or directing it. So including all those different groups on campus, and as the big word here, empower. One of the interviewees at the University of Central Florida, which I'm sure, as many of you know, is an institution that does have a very innovative culture. They talk about everyone on campus being in charge of their own area for innovation, their own chief innovation officers in their own way. So there is not one person that this all rolls up to, that everyone follows, but involving all those groups and everyone having an equal seat or an equal say in driving forward different ideas on campus. And as I was saying, failure is part of the process. So, starting with that, the experiment phase, pursuing different paths, and if failure was to occur, to learn from that and then adjust and move forward, not using failure as a wall or a barrier to stop innovation, and also not using failure as a tool to prevent innovation in terms of it being, I don't want to pursue this because it may not work and then I'll get in trouble, and I don't want to bring, that type of attention to myself or my department or my part of the institution, knowing that that is part of the process and that it's an important part of the process, to learn and to grow from going through these processes. So with barriers to innovation, as I was just talking about, failure could perhaps be one of them, but we asked this particular list in terms of, and there was larger definitions for each of these factors that we didn't necessarily put on the slide here, but again, it was the, ranked number 1 or ranked top 3 in terms of, are these barriers for innovation on your campus. Cultural factors, as you see, and structural factors in terms of being ranked within the top 3 are pretty close there, 78% and 80%. Cultural factors are, again, individuals on campus that perhaps are opposed to innovation or change. So you see that ranked 34% for the number 1 factor as well. And structural factors, again, goes back to, as I was talking about, leadership starting at the top, providing a structure and a culture where individuals can get together and collaborate, bring all those different groups together and move forward with a particular plan. Sometimes structural factors could be silos, different groups not talking to each other, working in parallel rather than in unison on some of these efforts, or having to get different approvals or different groups moving different projects forward. So that is, another big big factor here with structural factors. Resources, you see, still very important there at 61%, but a little bit lower compared to the cultural and structural factors, which can be, addressed on campus. Resources is always going to be an issue. Financing is always going to be an issue. But we know cultural factors and structural factors is definitely one area that change could be taking place, and it wouldn't necessarily draw upon pulling resources to make some of those changes. Jill, did you want to add anything to this barrier slide?
No, I think you did a great job covering this. But I guess the one thing that has stuck out for me is the institutional memory and how important that can be. We know when there's turnover, it often is based on memory. I actually was just at an institution function last night, and there were all these, oh, remember when this happened, and remember when we implemented digital courseware in our classes, and it was just interesting. I haven't been on that campus in a few years, and so we all know that memory gets really shady after a while. So I think that need to really document what we've tried. Did it work? What we've tried and what the results of those trials were, the trial and error, because otherwise we fall into that trap of duplicating, or we also fall into the trap of not duplicating because we say, oh, we tried that years ago, where if we've documented and said, oh, we've tried to implement, X, Y, Z, but maybe it was the way in which we tried to implement or innovate. So I think that institutional memory, if we can, that need for documentation of our these trial and errors or trial and successes can only help the institution in the future.
So going back to the idea of cultural factors, structural factors being barriers, Dr. Brown at Florida Atlantic gave us a great quote in the story when doing an interview with her, just that real can-do attitude of, not accepting barriers. And if there is someone who is saying no, that's okay. That is their position, their right to do that. They're obviously in a role at the institution for a reason, so it's okay for someone to say no, but at their particular office that they're going to try to find an alternative path either around that person or going back to the drawing board and trying to see how perhaps the proposal they gave to that person, how they could perhaps amend it to get greater buy-in from that person and change that no into a yes down the road. So not necessarily accepting no and then having that be the end point to a particular project or path, either finding a way around or trying to go back and involve that person more, understand their needs, and try to address them and give them that seat at the table to get that buy-in in the process as they move forward. So taking those lessons learned, this was kind of what I call my overly simplified model for innovation that we've learned about. So it's just basically getting input from all those groups on campus, not leaving any one particular group out, making sure everyone has a seat at the table, listening to everyone's kind of perspectives on different projects, getting support from the top, so getting that structure in place. As we saw, that could be a great barrier, but also getting that culture there, knowing that that there is goals being set and accountability being expected to drive forward some of these projects. Having that support from the top is important. Also, access to funding, and then that cross collaboration. So again, that's the buy-in from all different groups, everyone working together to drive forward these innovative projects on campus. And that was the last of our slides. Jill, did you have anything to add on those last couple of slides I had there, or do you want to start opening up to more questions and comments?
I'm hoping we can get into the questions and comments because it looks like we have quite a few in the Q&A section. So we could just, Andrew, do you want to just get started on some of these?
Sure. If there's anyone there that you see you want to start with, that's fine, and then I'll work to also go through and find some good ones in here for us.
Sure. So back at the beginning, Christy mentioned, I'm just looking at this. Innovation from the definition given sounds as though it might not include cutting back, rolling back, or simplifying. Is it definitionally always forward-facing, never resuscitating previous abandoned approaches? I love the question, and Christy, it kind of ties back actually to, I think, what I was saying, that the institutional memory piece, right? Resuscitating previous or abandoned approaches, yes, with that with the not only the memory but the documentation, we can do that, and I do think that that's a great, it can fall within that. And I think that including cutting back and rolling back or simplifying, we were looking at revenue savings and cutting back in terms of costs, but sure, cutting back, simplifying. I think sometimes simplification, especially on the academic side of the house, can definitely be a part of innovation. So definitely kind of falls with all of these, fall within that broader definition.
I see one here from Mike talking about CBE and the federal guidelines and rules stifling innovation. I think that came up in this barriers slide that we have here. Regulatory factors, you see 35% ranking it in the top 3. So that, that's all these here as you see, well over a third, ranking them pretty highly. 10% ranking that as the #1 factor, stifling or providing a barrier to them. So I do think, some of these regulations are posing barriers to individuals or institutions. But as we've seen with CBE and, other, changes, working with different organizations, working with, the Department of Ed, change can happen. So I don't think necessarily throwing your hands up that just say regulations or accreditors is necessarily the best way to approach this. I think it's, contacting these individuals and these organizations and these departments and trying to work with them. And again, just as we were talking about involving all groups on campus, involving some of these outside organizations is equally as important, bringing them to the table and, addressing their concerns and getting their buy-in. At Learning House, we always, work with our partners to make sure that we're in step, with their regional accreditors, and we always, bring that up is, not to necessarily look at the accreditor as being someone who's trying to stop you, but, working with them and, making sure you were staying within the rules, addressing their concerns, and making sure that everyone is happy at the end of the day, not seeing it as a wall that you can't overcome.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, Andrew, just from some personal perspective. I was in an academic administrator role when those regulations came down. So I do understand a little bit what you're talking about, because I think just before that, it was kind of like the Wild West with CBE. And I remember even, people speculating when the regulations would come out and can we get in and start on board and ramp up this program before they come out. So I do see a little bit about what you're saying in terms of stifling innovation, and maybe at the same time some regulations might be a stimulant to innovation. So just a little to think about, Andrew.
Right.
I see another question about funding. If funding isn't put aside for these initiatives, where does funding come from? And again, great question. I think that goes back to that a lot of that you hit it with the word initiatives. We asked about funding for innovation, not specific. We didn't give examples of or anything. So I think in the mind, perhaps, of the survey taker, it's like, have we budgeted for innovation? So have we budgeted for an innovation hub or an office of innovation, or funding for faculty to do innovative practices, as opposed to some initiatives that would be considered innovative, right? So in our budgets, like I said earlier, we might have those initiatives earmarked for money, but they're not specifically termed innovation. And that's kind of where my head's been going with that, and how we could more directly get into how innovation is funded on campuses.
Here's one from Fred Ellis here, Jill, that I just wanted to pose to you.
Sure.
That you obviously work and talk with a number of different schools. Would cultural and resource factors present a healthy barrier for institutions based on their division status, D1 versus D2 versus D3 athletic schools? Do you see any difference there, you think?
That's, again, a great question. It was the structural and cultural factors. I think we can, I mean, this is all supposition, right? We didn't get into this in the survey.
Right.
We didn't break down the respondents by their Carnegie classification. I think definitely cultural factors could come into play for that across different types of institutions, definitely. Structural factors, I might say not as much, but I think cultural factors, especially against a, type of student, you could even be looking at, you're comparing an adult serving institution versus a traditional institution or a small on campus or an Ivy. So yeah, I think there's definitely cultural factors based on the type of institution that could be affecting the response. Yep. Oh.
Yeah, I agree. I think the structural factors is definitely something that can be addressed no matter what status the school is. I think that's more of a self-imposed, structures are self-imposed. I don't think outside forces necessarily impact that as greatly as one may think. And resources, again, it's just at what scale is an institution looking to address these changes. I think, there's always limited resources no matter what institution you go to. Sometimes maybe you don't feel it as strongly, but I think any school that we talk to, even the most innovative, would still point to resources always being, an issue to stifle what they were trying to do. Cultural, I agree with you, Jill, with the cultural aspect that you're talking about.
Andrew, I have a question from Steve Van Didevond. And Steve, I hope I said your last name correctly. In the planned, unplanned, centralized, decentralized slide, which I put back up, how are each of these factors defined, and what does planned in a decentralized setting look like?
In terms of the definitions, I'm not sure we had set definitions up on that particular question. I know that we did on some of these other ones as we talk about the barriers. We tried to define out what we meant by some of those terms. But with that one, planned and unplanned, decentralized, and centralized, the planned gets into one of the follow-up questions that we had was around, including innovation in your strategic or your academic plan. So planned being that that there were goals in place, either if they were being strictly followed or just lip service. We didn't necessarily break that down, but it was that, there was goals and a plan for innovation for that campus. There was some sort of document there that would list out what some of these projects are. And then in terms of the centralized, decentralized, that gets into the question around, was there a singular person responsible for making sure that those goals or projects were being met or not, or was it more that each department or each area of the campus was kind of responsible for their own pushing their own initiatives forward? There wasn't one singular person controlling the funding, wasn't necessarily owning up to all the goals on campus. So I think that's what we were getting at with that particular question. In terms of planned decentralized, was that the question, Jill?
Yeah.
Or is it unplanned centralized? Which I forgot which one you were specifically.
Planned in a decentralized.
So planned in a decentralized, obviously that there would be set goals or initiatives on campus, but they were tasked out to different departments or segments of the institution. So perhaps there was a goal that we're going to, change our application process. And so that was tagged to the enrollment department. We're going to update our core curriculum, and that was tasked to, specific academic departments. So each decentralized unit was in charge of their own innovation, but that those innovations were, set forth in a planned, document or a central area. Jill, would you disagree or change any of that?
No, it's perfect. That was kind of I think that was kind of your specialty too, with this area, the planned and unplanned and centralized, decentralized.
I think, yeah, we tried to get at, how, kind of how we're, understanding that innovation can take place anywhere on campus and anyone can be in charge of it. So how do we kind of get at that through a question that will kind of make a little bit of sense and give us some bit of data to look at? And so I think this is what we kind of came up with. I think going through some of the interviews, maybe we would tweak it if we were to replicate it and try to run it again. But definitely get at the idea of where and how things are going on at campus.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. Hi, Taylor Kendall. How are you? I see, where does future forecasting fit? We always seem to explore innovation as it currently exists, as opposed to how it might be in 2, 5, 10 years. I'm going to take a stab at this, hoping I understand your question correctly. And I'm going to link it back actually to when we're looking at strategic academic planning, right? We're typically looking at 5-year plans. So I think that, on most campuses, we're hoping, well, a planned innovation, or, you're piloting maybe, and then you're rolling out. So I do think that it's going to be over, a year or two. But if you're actually looking at that, where could we be innovative on campus? Where can we be, where are areas in the academic side of the house that could increase student success and retention, let's say? What are new programs could do that? Where are alternative credentials fitting in? I think, part of looking at innovation is really being able to have that kind of plan. How are you rolling it out? How are you rolling it out over time? And our other word that we love that is often hand in hand with innovation is scale, right? How are we scaling this? So once we have that group, as Evangeline Cummings said, that we put together these innovators, this incubation of innovators, or how do we build that from kind of a pilot phase to scaling it? And I think that's where that time frame comes in, Taylor. Andrew, I don't know if you have any further comment on that.
No, I think you kind of addressed it. I don't have anything to add at this one.
Great.
Thank you, Andrew and Jill, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. We hope you found the strategies that we shared today valuable. Let us know what you thought about today's webinar by clicking the survey link posted in the chat pane. You can learn more about how institutions view drivers and barriers to innovation in the State of Innovation in Higher Education report. To download your free copy, visit learninghouse.com/innovation2018. Now, if you found today's webinar informative, I encourage you to attend the 2018 Connect Higher Education Summit, presented by Learning House. Join us June 12th through 13th in Louisville, Kentucky, to explore emerging trends and strategies for driving innovation in the higher education space. Attendees will be among the first to hear key findings from the 2018 Online College Students Report, developed by Learning House and Aslanian Market Research. Visit connect.learninghouse.com to review the complete agenda and our roster of inspiring speakers. To thank you for attending today's webinar, you can register using the promo code LHFriend2018 and receive $200 off your registration fee. We hope to see you in Louisville on June 12th and 13th for Connect 2018. Again, Thank you. And today's webinar was presented by Learning House and the Online Learning Consortium. Have a wonderful day.